She was a billionaire. He fixed broken furniture for a living, and the night she knocked on his door, she already knew exactly whose door it was. That's what made it so complicated. Victoria Ashcroft could have called her driver, checked into a five-star hotel, or simply taken the elevator 12 floors up to her own penthouse. She had options. She always had options. That was the thing about money. It manufactured choices the way factories manufactured parts. But at 11:47 on a Thursday night, standing in a dim hallway that smelled faintly of sawdust and old varnish, she raised her hand and knocked on apartment 4B instead. She'd been wanting to do that for almost a year. If this story already has you curious, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this is just the beginning. The knock came at 11:47. Caleb Mercer knew the exact time because he'd been sitting at his kitchen table for the past hour staring at the same drawer pull he needed to refinish before morning. A brass antique from an 1890s sideboard that a client in Green Hills was paying good money to restore. And his phone was propped against his coffee mug showing the time because that was the only way he remembered to keep track of it when he got deep into work. He had a habit of losing hours. His daughter's third-grade teacher had once asked him if everything was okay at home, because Lily kept falling asleep at her desk on Fridays. That was when Caleb realized that staying up past midnight wasn't just his problem anymore. He'd gotten better about it. Mostly. But tonight the drawer pull wasn't cooperating, and his hands smelled like chemical stripper, and there was a podcast playing low through the Bluetooth speaker on the counter about American furniture history that he'd probably already heard twice, and he was 32 years old sitting alone in a Nashville apartment at nearly midnight on a Thursday. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, that fact landed on him with the full weight of what it actually was. Then someone knocked on his door. He didn't move at first. His building wasn't the kind of place where people knocked on doors at midnight for good reasons. The hallways were clean enough and the neighbors were decent, but it was also an old building with thin walls and a buzzer that worked maybe 60% of the time. And the kinds of visits that happened after 11 usually involved someone locked out of their own place, or a noise complaint from the unit above him where a guy named Derek apparently owned a drum kit he had no business owning. Caleb set down the brass pull and wiped his hands on a rag that was already past saving. He crossed the apartment in about 6 steps, it wasn't a large place, and checked the peephole out of habit before opening the door. The woman standing in the hallway looked like she'd been crying recently and had decided somewhere between wherever she started and his front door that she wasn't going to anymore. Her mascara hadn't run badly, but it had run enough. She was still wearing what was clearly an expensive dress, dark green silk or something that moved like silk, and her hair was half down in the way that suggested it had been carefully pinned up earlier and she'd pulled most of it loose herself. Her heels were in her left hand. She was standing in the hallway in bare feet. He opened the door. Victoria. Hi. She said it like the word cost her something. Then, I'm sorry, I know it's late. It's fine. He leaned against the doorframe, not to block the entrance, but because he wasn't sure what the right posture was for this situation and his body had to do something. You okay? She looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes that always seemed to be calculating something, or maybe remembering something, and then she said, No, not particularly. Okay, he said, and then he stepped back and held the door open. Come in, Mott. He'd lived in apartment 4B for 4 years. He'd moved in 8 months after his wife left, a fact he didn't think about as often as he used to, which probably meant he was doing better, or at least doing differently. The apartment had come furnished with things he didn't want and unfurnished with things he did, so over time he'd replaced everything, piece by piece, with furniture he'd either built or restored himself. The kitchen table was a 1940s farm table he'd found at an estate sale outside Murfreesboro for $40 and spent 3 weekends refinishing. The chairs didn't match, but they were solid. The bookshelves were floor to ceiling and slightly crooked in a way that bothered him every time he noticed it. Lily had put drawings on the refrigerator that were mostly horses and one that she claimed was a spaceship but looked more like a potato. It was not an impressive apartment, but it was real, and everything in it had a history he knew. Victoria stepped inside and looked around the way she sometimes did when she'd been in the hallway and glanced in, like she was trying to figure out the logic of the place. She'd been in his apartment exactly once before, 2 months ago, when he'd helped her carry a photography equipment box up from the lobby because the elevator was out and she was on the 12th floor and he happened to be walking behind her. She'd stood in his doorway for about 30 seconds and looked at his bookshelves and said, "You have good taste," in a tone that he hadn't been able to interpret. "Sit down," he said. "You want coffee? I've got coffee. Or tea. I have tea because Lily goes through phases." "Tea," she said. "Please." He went to the kitchen and she sat at his farm table, setting her heels on the floor beside the chair with a kind of exhausted precision. He filled the kettle and put it on the stove and spent a moment looking at the boxes in the cabinet before picking the chamomile because it was the least caffeinated thing he had. And it was almost midnight, and she didn't look like someone who needed more alertness right now. "I went on a date tonight," she said from the table. "Okay." "My mother set it up. She's been—" Victoria paused. He could hear her doing the thing where she chose words carefully. "She's been concerned that I spend too much time working." "Is she wrong?" "No, but that doesn't mean her solution is right." She was quiet for a second. His name was Damian Holloway. He manages an investment portfolio, he sits on 3 nonprofit boards, and he went to the right schools and comes from the right family, and he said my name in a way that I think he learned from watching movies. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. "That bad?" "He told me I was intimidating," she said it flatly. And then he spent the rest of dinner explaining what he meant by that, which was mostly that he thought I worked too much and didn't know how to let myself be taken care of. She put slight emphasis on the last phrase in a way that made it clear she was quoting. He said it twice, like the first time hadn't quite landed. The kettle was starting to heat. Caleb leaned his back against the counter and crossed his arms, not defensive, just listening. "He sounds like a piece of work," he said. "He's not a bad person," Victoria said, and her voice was careful in a way that told him she'd been wrestling with that assessment. "That's almost worse. He genuinely believes what he says. He thinks he's being honest and caring and that I should appreciate the candor." She looked at the surface of his kitchen table. I smiled through 3 courses and let him walk me to the car, and then I sat in the back seat for about 20 minutes going nowhere because I didn't want to go home. He understood that. He didn't say so. "I told Marcus to just drive," she added. "My driver. He's worked for me for 6 years. He drives me when I don't know where I want to go, and he doesn't ask, and I've never told him how grateful I am for that." "You should tell him." She looked up. "I know." A small smile, brief and real. "He drove around for a while, and then I said to bring me back here, and I was going to go upstairs and—" She stopped. "And?" "Pour a glass of wine and answer emails at midnight, which is what I usually do." Caleb didn't say anything. He turned back to the kettle because it was starting to whistle. "But I ended up in the hallway on your floor," she finished, "and I knocked." He poured the water over the tea bag and brought the mug to the table and set it in front of her. He went back for his own coffee. He was already caffeinated past the point of no return on sleep tonight, and then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I'm glad you knocked," he said. She looked at him. "You were working." I was staring at a drawer pull and pretending I was working. That got a real sound from her. Not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it, something that started in the back of her throat and moved forward. It changed her face briefly into something younger. "What's the drawer pull for?" "Restoration project, 1890s sideboard. Client wants it done by tomorrow noon, and I think the brass oxidation is fighting me on principle." "Are you going to make the deadline?" "Probably not if I'm sitting here talking to you." She wrapped both hands around the mug. Her nails were polished, dark burgundy, a few chips at the edges. "Then you should go work." "I should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. They talked for 2.5 hours, not about anything significant at first. He asked about the photography thing. He'd seen her out in the building parking lot a few weeks ago with a camera he recognized as expensive, pointing it at the sky. And she told him she'd gotten into it 3 years ago after a particularly brutal quarter at work, when her therapist had told her to find something that had nothing to do with numbers or outcomes. She'd picked photography almost randomly, she said. She wasn't naturally good at it. "Most things worth doing, you're not naturally good at," Caleb said. "That sounds like a refrigerator magnet." "Maybe. Doesn't make it wrong." She told him about the company. Not the details, just the shape of it. She ran an investment management firm that her father had started, and she'd spent the better part of a decade rebuilding from the inside after the 2008 crash had left it limping. She'd taken over at 24, which she said in the same tone people use when they describe a car accident they barely survived. Not dramatic, just factual. She'd been 24. She hadn't known what she was doing. She'd learned by not sleeping enough and making mistakes she still thought about. What was the worst one? Caleb asked. The worst mistake? Yeah. She considered this with the kind of seriousness that told him she had a real answer and was deciding whether to give it. I let someone go once, she said, finally. A CSFO. He wasn't performing well, he'll say the numbers were clear, but I moved too fast because I was trying to prove I could make hard decisions, and I didn't. She stopped. He had 2 kids. His wife had just been diagnosed with something serious. I knew that. I did it anyway because I thought doing it cleanly and quickly was the professional thing to do. She looked at her tea. He landed somewhere else eventually. He's fine now, I think. But I still think about the timing. I could have waited a month. I didn't. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You remember his kids? I remember everything I got wrong. That's not a flaw, he said. That's what makes you take it seriously. She looked at him. In his kitchen light, which was slightly too yellow, he needed to change the bulb. She had the expression of someone hearing something they needed to hear but hadn't expected. It lasted only a second before she rearranged it into something more neutral. You're easy to talk to, she said. I don't know why that surprises me. Because you don't let people in enough to find out, he said. It wasn't mean. He said it the way he'd say it to anyone he'd started to know. She didn't deny it. No, I don't. She turned the mug in her hands. It's not a trust thing, exactly. It's more that most people want something from me, and it's easier to manage that from a distance. What do you think I want? She looked at him steadily. Nothing. That's the strange part. He thought about telling her that wasn't entirely true, that there were things he wanted that he wasn't going to name out loud at nearly 2 a.m. at his kitchen table set. But he didn't. Some things were worth protecting until they were ready to be said properly. Instead, he said, Lily asked about you the other day. Victoria's expression shifted, calmer, warmer. She did? She saw you in the hallway with your camera, and she asked me if the lady upstairs was a photographer or a spy. He paused. She considers both equally interesting. What did you tell her? I said you were a neighbor who liked taking pictures. That's accurate. She was smiling now in a way that wasn't controlled or measured. She waved at me once, in the elevator. She had paint on her chin and she was very serious about it. She was going through a watercolor phase. We lost 2 weeks of dish towels. Victoria laughed. A real one this time. It came out slightly surprised, like she'd forgotten she could do that. Caleb watched it happen and felt something shift in his chest that he'd been doing his level best not to identify for the better part of 8 months. At 2:10, Victoria set down her empty mug and said she should go. I'll walk you to the elevator, he said. You don't have to. I know. They walked out into the hallway. The building was entirely quiet. Someone's television murmured through a door at the far end. The overhead light by the elevator had a flicker that maintenance had been promising to fix since February. She pressed the button for the elevator and they stood side by side. She was still in bare feet. She was holding her heels again. Thank you, she said, for this, for the tea, for not making it weird that I showed up at your door at midnight. It wasn't weird, he said. It kind of was. Maybe a little, he admitted. She looked at the elevator door. The date, she said. Damien. My mother is going to want to know how it went, and I'm going to have to tell her something. Tell her it went fine. She'll want to schedule a second one. Then tell her it didn't go fine. Victoria turned her head and looked at him with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite exasperation. My family doesn't really accept those answers cleanly. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. She stepped inside and then turned around to face him, holding the doors open with one hand. My sister's engagement brunch is Saturday morning, she said. It's a small thing. Family, mostly. Which means Damien will probably be there because my mother will have invited him. She paused. I know you probably have 1,000 things to do. Caleb studied her face. She wasn't asking. She wasn't not asking. She was standing in the elevator with her heels in her hand and mascara she'd cried off and dried and worn for another 2 hours without realizing, and she was being as careful with her words as she always was, which meant she was saying something between the lines. I don't have anything until the afternoon, he said, on Saturday. She held his gaze for a second that lasted longer than it should have. I'll text you the address, she said. Then the elevator doors closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment after that. The flickering light buzzed faintly. From somewhere above, through the building's old bones, he could hear what might have been the hum of a ventilation system, or the sound of a city doing what cities do at 2 in the morning. He went back inside, washed both mugs, stood at the kitchen counter for a while. The brass drawer pull was still on the table where he'd left it. He sat back down and picked it up and turned it over in his hands, and there was a tightness in his chest that had been there since she'd walked in and wasn't going anywhere. And he recognized it clearly and chose, for now, not to do anything about it except feel it. He worked until 4:30 and finished the drawer pull. It wasn't perfect. A few things never were, no matter how long you worked on them. But sometimes you got them close enough, and close enough was its own kind of honest. He managed 4 hours of sleep before Lily was standing beside his bed, informing him that there was no orange juice and they were out of her cereal, and also a bird was sitting on the window ledge doing something suspicious. Suspicious how? He asked without opening his eyes. It's looking at me. Birds look at things. It's looking at me specifically. He opened one eye. She was 8 years old, and she had his dark hair and her mother's eyes and a gap in her front teeth she'd been working through for most of 2nd grade. And she was staring at him with the absolute moral authority of a child who considered herself wronged by a bird and was not going to let the matter drop. I'll look at it, he said. It's on the window. I know where you said it was. He sat up. Lily stepped back 3 inches and watched him with the patience of someone who had learned that hovering didn't make things happen faster, but couldn't quite stop doing it anyway. He got up and looked at the bird. It was a sparrow. It appeared to be doing nothing sinister. He relayed this assessment. It keeps blinking at me, Lily said. All birds blink. Not like that. He looked at the sparrow. The sparrow looked back, blinked once in a completely ordinary sparrow fashion, and then flew away. See? He said. Lily considered this. Maybe it was a spy. That word. He thought of Victoria saying the same thing, relayed through his daughter's 8-year-old interpretation. He made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast because they were out of cereal, and Lily sat at the farm table and drew a horse on the back of a permission slip while she ate. And he stood at the counter and drank his coffee and thought about Saturday. His neighbor down the hall, a retired high school coach named Walt, who Caleb generally consulted for the kind of advice that came from simply having lived longer, was in the hallway that afternoon moving a broken folding chair toward the trash room. Let me look at that, Caleb said. It's done, Walt said. Give me 20 minutes. Walt handed it over with the expression of someone who had learned to accept help reluctantly. He was 64 and had bad knees and hands that shook slightly on the left side, and he never talked about that. Caleb didn't bring it up. They stood in the hall while Caleb assessed the chair. You know the woman on 12? Caleb asked. Walt raised an eyebrow. The photographer, dark hair, usually has the big camera bag. Saw her last week by the mailboxes. Seemed smart. Walt watched Caleb work the chair joint. Why? She knocked on my door last night. Okay. And I'm going to her sister's engagement brunch on Saturday. Walt was quiet for a moment. As what? Caleb looked up. As her neighbor. She just wanted someone to go with her. Huh? Walt looked entirely unconvinced without changing his expression at all, which was something Caleb had always found both infuriating and impressive. Her family is complicated, Caleb said. There's a guy, Damien. Her mother's been trying to set them up. And she's taking you instead. She's taking me as a friend. Uh-huh, Walt said again in exactly the same tone. Caleb fixed the chair in 18 minutes. He handed it back. Walt thanked him with a single nod, which was the Walt equivalent of an effusive speech. "You know the thing about broken furniture," Walt said before he went inside, gesturing vaguely at the chair. "It usually isn't as done as people think it is." He went inside and closed his door, and Caleb stood in the hallway for a moment wondering if that was a metaphor or if Walt was just talking about chairs. Probably both. With Walt, it was usually both. Friday night, Caleb got Lily to bed at a reasonable hour, 9 o'clock, which was reasonable by their standards, and sat at his kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about what he was doing. He was going to an engagement brunch in a part of Nashville where the driveways were longer than his entire street. He was going to walk into a room of people who read his financial situation in 3 seconds and form their conclusions in 5. He was going to stand next to a woman he'd been quietly, stubbornly, inconveniently drawn to for the better part of a year and pretend that he was simply her neighbor doing her a favor. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he'd had for about 8 months but rarely heard from. "The brunch is at my mother's house in Belle Meade, 10 a.m. You don't have to dress up, but they will all be dressed up, so..." Fair warning. There will be food and people who ask a lot of questions, and at least one person who will try to figure out what you do for a living and then reassess their interest in you based on the answer. He read it twice. Then he wrote back, "Should I be honest about the furniture?" 3 minutes passed. "Yes. I like that you're honest about the furniture." He set the phone down, picked it up again, typed, "I'll be there." He almost left it at that. Then he added, "Also, the bird was a sparrow. Lily has been informed." A pause. Then, "A sparrow. Definitely suspicious." He put the phone down and sat with his water and the apartment quiet around him, and the farm table solid under his hands. He wasn't under any illusions about what Saturday was, or what he was walking into, or the vast and complicated distance between his world and hers. He was a man who refinished furniture in a mid-range Nashville apartment building, and she was... He'd looked reluctantly after a conversation months ago had made him curious. She was a woman whose company managed assets worth more money than he would make across 7 lifetimes. That gap was real. He wasn't romantic enough about things to pretend otherwise. But she'd knocked on his door at 11:47, and she'd sat at his farm table for 2.5 hours and drunk chamomile tea and talked about the things she usually held close and laughed at something he said in a way that was completely unguarded. She'd knocked on his door. Not a penthouse door, not a hotel door, his. He thought about Walt's chair, about things that looked done but weren't. He thought about the particular silence of a 2 a.m. kitchen when someone fills it with conversation for the first time in longer than you want to count. He finished his water, went to bed, lay in the dark with Lily's soft snoring coming through the wall. She snored lightly and denied it categorically whenever he brought it up, and thought about the morning. Sleep came eventually, the way it always did, not when he chased it, but when he finally stopped. He wore the good shirt, not his nicest shirt. He owned exactly one shirt that could be described as genuinely nice, a dark navy button-down he'd bought 2 years ago for a client presentation that had ended with a handshake and a contract worth more than he'd made in the previous 6 months. But the good one. The one without fraying at the collar and without the small bleach mark on the left cuff that he usually covered with a watch. Dark gray, well-fitted because he'd actually tried it on before buying it, which was not always something he did. He paired it with charcoal slacks and the leather shoes he kept polished because Lily had once asked why some men's shoes looked sad, and he'd never recovered from that observation. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 8:15 on Saturday morning and assessed what he was looking at, which was a man who repaired antique furniture for a living and was about to walk into a Belle Meade engagement brunch attended by people whose morning coffee probably cost more than his truck payment. He looked presentable. He looked like himself, which was the best he could manage, and he decided somewhere around 3 in the morning that looking like himself was probably the only honest thing he could bring to this situation. Lily was at his mother's place for the weekend, a standing arrangement that had started when Lily was 3 and had calcified into something Lily looked forward to more than almost anything else, because Caleb's mother let her stay up late and made biscuits from scratch and didn't appear to have any rules about how much television was appropriate. He'd dropped her off the night before. She'd waved at him from the porch without looking back. He locked the apartment at 9:15 and took the elevator down. And when the doors opened on the ground floor, Victoria was standing in the lobby. She was dressed in something that managed to be elegant and understated at the same time, cream-colored and structured, the kind of outfit that looked simple until you noticed the quality of it. Her hair was up. Her jewelry was minimal. She looked, in the morning light coming through the lobby's glass doors, composed and certain and exactly like someone who ran a company worth billions of dollars. She also had a small smudge of something, mascara or eyeliner, at the corner of her left eye that she clearly hadn't noticed. You have, He touched the corner of his own eye. Her hand went up immediately. Where? Left side, just at the edge. She pulled out her phone, used the front camera as a mirror, and dealt with it with a precision that suggested this wasn't the first time. Thank you, she said, dropping the phone back into her bag. Then she looked at him fully, and something passed across her face that she didn't completely contain. You look good? You sound surprised. I'm not surprised. She said it quickly. Then, Marcus is outside. He followed her out to the waiting car, a black sedan so clean it looked like it had never experienced weather. And the driver, Marcus, was a solid man in his mid-50s with close-cropped gray hair and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, which Caleb recognized as the face of someone who had spent years being professionally invisible and had gotten good at it. Morning, Marcus, Victoria said. Morning, Ms. Ashcroft. Marcus glanced at Caleb with a brief, assessing look that was not unfriendly. Sir? Caleb, he said. Mr. Caleb. Marcus held the door. Caleb got in first because he wasn't sure of the protocol, and that seemed like the right move. The drive to Belmead took 22 minutes. Victoria sat beside him with her hands in her lap and looked out the window, and Caleb watched Nashville slide past and tried to read the tension in her profile without making it obvious he was doing it. Tell me about your sister, he said. Victoria looked at him. Sophie? Is that her name? Sophia, she's 27. Victoria paused in that careful way. She's the one who works with the family in a different sense. She's good at the social part, the dinners and the events and the relationships. She's genuinely good at it. She likes it. A pause. We're not close in the way people expect sisters to be. But we're not distant either. It's more that we make sense to each other, even when we're very different. And the guy she's marrying? Griffin Hale. He's 31, comes from old money, works in real estate development. He's fine. He's actually fine. I've spent 2 years looking for a reason not to trust him, and I haven't found one, which is either a good sign or a sign I need to look harder. She turned back to the window. He makes Sophie laugh. That matters. What does your mother think of him? She loves him. He went to the right schools, his family has the right last name, he holds a fork correctly. Victoria's voice was dry, but not cruel. My mother's primary criterion for a partner has always been whether they can handle the optics, and Damien checks those boxes. She didn't answer immediately. Damien checks every box on her list, she said finally. That's why she's been pushing for 2 years. She turned to look at him. He's going to be there today. She would have called him after I told her the date was fine. She always calls him after. What did you tell her? That it was fine. He told her to say exactly that. He felt briefly like maybe that hadn't been the right advice. And then she called Damien. And then she called Damien, Victoria confirmed. They rode in silence for another few minutes. The houses outside the windows were getting larger and further apart. Nashville's version of wealth architecture. Enormous and new-looking or enormous and carefully preserved, very little in between. What do you want me to do? Caleb asked. When we're there. Victoria looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, am I someone you brought so you're not walking in alone? Or am I someone you brought because you want to say something by bringing me? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. I don't want to use you as a prop, she said. I'm not doing that. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Longer. I want someone there who sees things clearly, she said. Damien is very good at making a room agree with him. My mother is very good at shaping the narrative of a situation before anyone else gets to it. and I've spent years walking into rooms full of both of them and coming out feeling like the version of me they'd decided on together. She looked at him steadily. You see things clearly. You say what you actually think. I want that in the room. It wasn't everything she could have said. He was almost certain it wasn't the whole truth, but it was the part she'd decided to give him, and he'd been around long enough to know the difference between someone holding back and someone offering what they had. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah, I can do that. Marcus pulled through iron gates onto a driveway lined with dogwood trees that had just finished blooming, leaving a scatter of white petals on the gravel. The house at the end was substantial in the way that old money tends to be. Not flashy, but unwilling to make apologies. Cream-colored stone, black shutters. A front door that looked like it had been painted and repainted over 100 years until it had become something between black and green. Several other cars were already parked along the side of the drive. Ready? Caleb asked. Victoria was looking at the house with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something that had been there a long time, layered over with control. I'm always ready, she said. That's not actually the problem. The inside of Eleanor Ashcroft's house looked the way old money houses always looked in Caleb's limited experience of them. Like every object had been chosen with intention and then left alone for decades to develop its own authority. The entry hall had a Persian rug so faded it had gone abstract. There were framed portraits on the wall that were clearly ancestors, but that nobody would have explained even if you asked, because in rooms like this the expectation was that you'd already know. A woman appeared from somewhere to the right of the hallway who was clearly the catering staff. Pressed white shirt, efficient movement, tray in hand, and behind her, through a set of open glass doors, the event was already underway. Caleb could see maybe 15 people, could hear the particular quality of conversation that happens when everyone in the room knows each other and is performing being relaxed. Victoria. The voice came from the far side of the hall, and Caleb turned to see a woman who he immediately understood was Eleanor Ashcroft, Victoria's mother, the way you sometimes understood things without needing to be told. She was probably 60, elegant in that severe way, with Victoria's eyes but harder. She was smiling, but the smile had conditions attached to it. She kissed Victoria on the cheek. Then her gaze moved to Caleb with the quick, measuring quality of someone who had spent a lifetime calibrating social situations. This is Caleb Mercer, Victoria said, my neighbor. He was kind enough to come. Eleanor Ashcroft. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm and brief. How lovely. Any friend of Victoria's. Thank you for having me, Caleb said. He meant it plainly and didn't add anything to it, which he noticed seemed to mildly disconcert her in some way she immediately smoothed over. Come in, both of you. Sophie's been asking about you. That last part was addressed to Victoria in a tone that suggested the asking had been accompanied by other commentary. And Damien is here. He was so pleased to come. I knew you wouldn't mind. Victoria's expression didn't change by a degree that most people would have registered. Caleb registered it. Of course, she said. Sophia Ashcroft was nothing like her sister except in the basic geography of her face. Same bone structure, softer expression, the ease of someone who had made peace with her family's world instead of quietly fighting it. She was bright and genuinely warm, and she hugged Victoria in a way that had real feeling in it, and then she shook Caleb's hand and looked at him with frank curiosity. Victoria said you restore furniture, Sophie said. Antiques, mostly. I love that. Griffin's grandmother has this armoire that's been in the family since the 30s, and it's absolutely falling apart. Do you do house calls? Depends on the armoire. Sophie laughed. I'm going to take that as a yes. She glanced between them with a smile that was knowing without being pointed. Come get something to eat. Mother has outdone herself, which means the caterers have outdone themselves. Griffin Hale was indeed fine, in exactly the way Victoria had described. He shook Caleb's hand solidly, asked genuine questions about the restoration business, and mentioned his grandmother's armoire a second time, which Caleb took as a good sign. He had the unremarkable ease of a man who'd never had to work very hard at being liked, but he used it generously rather than selfishly, which made the difference. The room was exactly what Caleb had expected. Well-dressed people on the younger end of wealthy, with a scattering of older relatives who watched proceedings with the quiet authority of people who'd seen enough to stop being surprised. A few of them looked at Caleb with the particular calibrated interest of people working out where he fit. He recognized the calculation and didn't respond to it. Then Damien Holloway crossed the room, and Caleb understood immediately why Victoria had said he wasn't a bad person. He wasn't. He was polished in a way that read as genuine rather than performed. Good-looking, confident, the kind of man who filled a room not by taking up space but by making everyone in it feel like he'd been hoping to see them specifically. He moved directly toward Victoria with a smile that was warm enough to be convincing. "Victoria," he kissed her cheek. "You look wonderful. I didn't know you were bringing someone." "Caleb, this is Damien Holloway. Damien, Caleb Mercer, my neighbor." The two men shook hands. Damien's grip was the kind that communicated something, not aggressive, but measured. He smiled at Caleb with his eyes as well as his mouth, which was the sign of someone who'd learned exactly how to do that. "Neighbor," Damien said. "Which building?" "The Whitmore, on Elliston." Something moved through Damien's expression that he controlled instantly and completely. The Whitmore was a decent building. It was also emphatically not Belle Mead. "Nice area," he said smoothly. "It suits me," Caleb said. They stood in a small cluster for a few minutes, the four of them, the way people do at parties before the geometry of the room rearranges. Damien talked easily, included everyone, was funny in an anecdotal way that required an audience. He told a story about a charity gala from 2 months ago, where apparently a fire alarm had gone off mid-auction, and it was a good story, competently told. Caleb watched Victoria during the telling of it and noticed that she laughed at the right moments and none of the others. Then someone called Damien away, older man across the room, the kind of summons that Damien responded to with apology and evident importance, and the geometry rearranged. "He's good," Caleb said quietly. Victoria looked at him. "What do you mean?" "At this. At a room." He said it without criticism. "Yes." She watched Damien move across the space, greeting the older man with practiced deference. "He's always been good at it." "What happened on Thursday night? The dinner?" She was quiet for a moment. "He was doing the same thing, being good at it, and I kept waiting to feel something." She looked down at her champagne glass, which she hadn't drunk from. At one point he said that what I needed was someone stable, grounding, and he said it like it was a diagnosis, like he'd assessed the situation and determined what I required, and he was willing to provide it. She glanced up. "Not once did he ask what I wanted." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment. Around them the room continued its well-dressed performance, and somewhere behind him Sophie was laughing at something Griffin had said. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "From what?" "In general." She turned slightly to face him more directly, which took them a fraction out of the main current of the room's conversation. "I want to run my company the way I think it should be run, not the way my family thinks looks good from outside," she said. "I want to take photographs of things that have nothing to do with money. I want to have dinner with someone who isn't calculating what they get from being in the room with me." A pause. "I want my apartment to feel like a place I chose to be, not a place I retreated to." "Does it feel like that?" "Sometimes." She looked toward the garden doors. "Less lately." He thought about his own apartment, the farm table and the crooked bookshelves and Lily's horse drawings on the refrigerator and the faint permanent smell of wood and chemical stripper that never entirely went away. All the small accumulated evidences of a life actually lived in a space. "It takes time," he said. "Or intention," she said. Before he could respond, Eleanor Ashcroft materialized at Victoria's elbow with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades steering social situations without appearing to steer them. "Darling, Sophie wants to get the family photograph done before brunch is set. You too as well, Caleb. We'd love to have you." The "you too as well" was inclusive in the way that technically included but actually separated, and Caleb recognized it and let it go. The family photograph was taken in the garden, where the late morning light was genuinely beautiful and the dogwood petals had blown against the garden wall in a way that would look very good in pictures. Victoria stood beside Sophie, and Eleanor stood beside Victoria, and Caleb stood at the edge of the group because that was where he was placed and he was not going to make that into something it didn't need to be. But then Sophie reached out and pulled him in. "Come here. Don't be ridiculous. Stand next to Victoria." And the photographer said something, and the group shifted, and Caleb found himself standing beside Victoria while somebody's aunt counted down and the shutter clicked 3 times. Victoria's hand found his forearm briefly, the way you might reach for something nearby when you're steadying yourself, and then she let go. Brunch was served in the dining room at a table that was too long for the number of guests, but implied that larger gatherings were the room's default. Caleb found himself seated across from Damien and 2 seats down from Victoria, which was probably not accidental. Eleanor had arranged the seating. Eleanor arranged everything. The conversation at the table did the thing conversations at that kind of table always did. It moved through topics like it was conducting an audit, the state of the market, a recent gallery opening, a charity organization that several people at the table served on. 2 people had opinions about a restaurant that had recently opened in the Gulch. Through all of it, Damien was fluent and attentive, turning to various people with the practiced attention of a man who understood that being listened to begins with appearing to listen. Then someone asked Caleb what he did. It came from Victoria's uncle, a broad man named Richard with an expensive watch, and the particular confidence of someone who asked questions as a form of establishing hierarchy rather than gaining information. "Furniture restoration," Caleb said. "As in antiques?" "Mostly. Some custom work." Richard processed this. "You have a shop?" "Studio. I work out of my apartment building. I've been looking at a space in East Nashville, but the rents have gotten complicated." "Complicated," Richard repeated, in a tone that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite. "Rent will do that," Caleb said pleasantly. Damien looked up from his plate. Something in his expression had shifted subtly. A new attention, focused. "How did you and Victoria meet?" he asked. His tone was perfectly conversational. "We live in the same building," Caleb said. "Ah." A small pause. "The Whitmore." "Right." "Victoria talked about possibly moving," Eleanor said from the head of the table to no one in particular. "I always thought she should have bought the place on Tyne when it was available." "I like the Whitmore," Victoria said evenly. "Of course," Eleanor said, in a tone that was not agreement. Damien set his fork down with the small deliberateness of a man who had decided to say something and was choosing how to frame it. "I'll admit," he said, smiling at the table in a way that invited everyone in, "I'm always curious about what draws people to each other. In a building, I mean. Neighbors have such proximity without necessarily having anything else in common." It was well done. It was the kind of observation that sounded like general sociological curiosity and meant something much more specific. Caleb watched it land and felt, without urgency, a small, calm clarity. "I think it's actually the opposite," Caleb said. Damien looked at him. "How so?" "Neighbors end up with more in common than people expect. You see each other on regular days, not the curated version, the version that exists at 7 in the morning in the elevator, or when something goes wrong and you need help. That's actually more information than you'd get from most social situations." He picked up his water glass. "Proximity gives you the real version of someone." A brief silence. Not hostile, thoughtful even, but something in it was deliberate. "That's an interesting way to look at it," Damien said. "Victoria is one of the most honest people I've spent time with," Caleb said. He said it simply, without decoration, addressing no one at the table in particular. "I figured that out pretty fast." Victoria was looking at him from 2 seats down. He didn't look at her directly. Eleanor changed the subject. She was very good at changing subjects. Amen. After brunch, the gathering moved back through the glass doors to the garden, where coffee was served and the late morning had gone fully warm. Caleb stood at the edge of the garden near the wall where the dogwood petals had accumulated, holding a coffee that was genuinely excellent, and watched the room rearrange itself. He watched Victoria navigate the social geometry of her own family, the way she moved from Sophie's side to a conversation with 2 people he didn't know, the way she listened with real attention even when he could see from her posture that she was tired. The way she held herself in this house was different from how she held herself in his kitchen. Not false exactly, more compressed, like she was taking up less space than she actually needed. Damien approached him from the left. Caleb saw him coming and didn't shift his posture. "Victoria mentioned the night she knocked on your door," Damien said. Not accusatorially, conversationally, the way he did everything. "After our date." "She mentioned she had a rough night," Caleb said. "She ended up at your door." Damien looked across the garden toward where Victoria was standing. "That's a very instinctive place to go." "She needed somewhere comfortable," Caleb said. "That's not complicated." "No," Damien agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I've known Victoria for 2 years. I think she's exceptional. I think she's also someone who can confuse comfort with something else when she's vulnerable." He said it with genuine concern in his voice, which was the more sophisticated version of what he was doing. "I'm not questioning your character. I just think she's worth being careful about." Caleb looked at him. He waited a moment before responding, not to gather himself, but because some things deserved a second before being said. "She's one of the least vulnerable people I've met," he said. "I think you might be describing what you need to be true, not what actually is." Damien's expression didn't change, but something in it reset, the way an image resets when the focus shifts. "Fair enough," he said, and his voice was still perfectly even. "I appreciate the candor." He moved away with that same fluid ease, back into the main current of the gathering, and Caleb turned back to the garden wall and drank his coffee and thought about what had just happened. Not triumphantly, not especially, just clearly. Victoria appeared at his elbow 3 minutes later. "What did he say?" she asked. "That you might confuse comfort with other things when you're vulnerable." She made a sound that wasn't a laugh. "He's said a version of that to me twice. He thinks it's concern." "I know. It's also a way of making me doubt my own judgment." "I know that too." She was quiet, standing beside him with her coffee cup in both hands, the garden wall at their backs. Somewhere inside, Sophie was laughing. The sound carried. "You told the table I was honest," she said. "You are." "You didn't have to say it." "No," he agreed. "I said it because it's true, not because it was useful." He glanced at her. "There's a difference." She looked at the garden, the well-maintained beds, the pale petals against the stone, and something in her face was doing the thing it did sometimes when she was working through something she hadn't expected to feel. "I've been coming to this house for 30 years, she said. "I don't think anyone has ever said something true about me at this table without wanting something in return for saying it." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response, they just needed to be heard. They stood at the garden wall and finished their coffee, and Sophie waved from across the garden, and the late morning stretched out warm and unhurried, and for a while it was enough just to be in the same place without any of it requiring explanation. On the drive back, Marcus took the long way without being asked. Neither of them mentioned it. Victoria looked out the window and Caleb watched Nashville come back into focus. The streets that narrowed, the buildings that crowded together, the neighborhoods that didn't care about optics or old money or who held a fork correctly. And he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since they'd turned into that dogwood-lined driveway 3 hours ago. "Your uncle wants to know what furniture restoration pays," he said. Victoria turned from the window. "My uncle wants to know everything it's impolite to ask." "I figured." "What did you want to say?" "Enough," he said, which was the truth. Some months were better than others, and there had been genuinely hard stretches, and he still thought about the East Nashville studio every time a rent alert came through his phone. But enough. It was enough. "I wanted to say enough." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he'd started to recognize, the one that wasn't performing anything, that was just her, seeing something she wasn't going to immediately categorize. "That's a good answer," she said. He thought about what she'd said at the table, what she'd said in the garden, what she'd said at 2 a.m. in his kitchen. The things she held close and the things she gave away without realizing, the way her hands had found his forearm in the garden for half a second before she'd let go. He thought about how the truth of a thing and the right time to say it were almost never the same moment. How sometimes you had to carry something carefully for a long time before the carrying made sense. The Whitmore came into view down the block. "Caleb," Victoria said. "Yeah." A pause. The car slowed. "I'm glad you came today." He looked at her. "Me too." She held his gaze for a second, then turned back to the window as Marcus pulled to the curb. The doors opened. The afternoon was warm and smelled like Nashville on a Saturday. Someone somewhere was grilling, and there was a lawnmower going, and two kids were on the sidewalk doing something with chalk. They walked into the lobby together. The elevator doors were open when they got there, which almost never happened. They stepped in. The doors closed. The building hummed around them. 12 floors. The elevator moved with that slow, slightly creaking patience it always had, and they stood side by side in the small space without saying anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was the kind of thing that told you something if you were paying attention. The doors opened on 4. Caleb stepped out. "Saturday went okay," he said from the hallway. Victoria was still inside. She was looking at him through the open doors in a way that was entirely direct and not trying to hide whatever it was. "Better than okay," she said. The doors closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment, alone again on the 4th floor with its flickering light and the smell of old building, and somewhere, faintly, sawdust. His apartment was 6 steps away. He went in, changed out of the gray shirt, put the kettle on out of habit, even though it was 2 in the afternoon and he didn't really want tea. He stood in his kitchen and looked at the farm table and thought about a woman standing in a garden, not knowing how to take up the space she deserved, and a man saying something true without wanting anything for saying it, and how sometimes those two things were exactly enough to start with. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Victoria. "Tell Lily the sparrow says hi." He stood there in his kitchen with the kettle starting to heat and read it twice, and then set the phone face down on the counter and put both hands on the edge of the sink and looked out the window at the ordinary Saturday afternoon going on without him. The tightness in his chest was there again. He'd stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was. That didn't mean he knew what to do with it. Not yet. The week after the brunch was quiet in the particular way that things are quiet when something has shifted underneath them and neither person has decided yet what to call it. Caleb picked up Lily from his mother's on Sunday afternoon, and they stopped for tacos on the way home because Lily declared that tacos were a Sunday requirement, which was a rule she'd invented approximately 3 weeks ago and was now treating as established law. She talked the whole drive back about a movie she'd watched at her grandmother's, and a caterpillar she'd found in the backyard, and a disagreement she'd had with her grandmother's cat, Winston, who she considered willfully uncooperative. "He sat on my drawing," she said. "Cats do that." "He sat on it on purpose." "Cats don't do things on purpose." "Winston does." Caleb didn't have a strong counter-argument for Winston specifically, so he let it go. He got her home, got her through the bath and the bedtime negotiation, which always involved at least one attempt to extend things by asking questions she'd thought of, questions that were sometimes genuine and sometimes tactical, and he could usually tell the difference, but not always. And by 9:30 she was asleep and he was at the kitchen table again with the kind of work that didn't require his full attention, so his full attention went somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about what Damien had said in the garden, not because it bothered him, or not only because it bothered him, but because it sat in a particular way that things sit when they're partially true and you don't want them to be. She can confuse comfort with something else when she's vulnerable. It was a manipulation, he was certain of that. It was designed to make him doubt what he'd seen, but underneath the manipulation was a question he didn't have a clean answer to. What if she had knocked on his door because it was the nearest door? And the kindness he'd offered that night had filled a space that the date had emptied. And what he'd felt at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. was real, but what she'd felt was something different. Something that would rearrange itself into ordinary gratitude once the crisis settled. He'd been here before. Not with Victoria specifically, but with the version of events where the dependable man is the one people come to when things fall apart and leave when things improve. He knew that story. He'd lived enough of it to recognize the opening chapters. His ex-wife, Dana, had told him once, near the end, when they were having the kind of honest conversation that only happens when a relationship is already on its way out, that she'd married him partly because he was stable. Safe. She'd said it like it was a compliment and cried while saying it, so maybe she meant it as one. But stable and safe were not the same as chosen. He'd understood that eventually. He didn't want to be someone's safe harbor again. He wanted to be someone's choice. He sat with that thought and a half-empty coffee cup until 11, then went to bed. And if he slept well, it wasn't because anything had resolved. Monday brought 3 clients and a delivery of materials he'd been waiting on for 2 weeks. A set of brass hardware for a Victorian writing desk that a professor at Vanderbilt had brought him in pieces last month, each piece wrapped in tissue paper with a care that told Caleb she understood what she had. He spent most of the day at his work table in the spare room he'd converted into a studio, which was not a large space but organized in the specific way of someone who'd thought hard about how they worked and arranged things accordingly. Lily got home from school at 3:15 on the bus, let herself in with her key. She'd gotten her own key 6 months ago and treated it with a seriousness that Caleb found both touching and slightly exhausting, and did her homework at the kitchen table with the focused energy of someone working against a deadline, which she was not, because her homework was adding 2-digit numbers and reading 2 pages of a book about a rabbit who wanted to be a chef. At 4:30, they heard Victoria in the hallway. They heard her because their building had thin walls, and the 4th-floor hallway had a particular acoustic quality that carried footsteps, and Caleb had learned over months to identify the specific rhythm of her stride: purposeful, slightly quick, the sound of someone who walked like they were already late for the next thing. "Is that the photography lady?" Lily asked without looking up from her rabbit book. "Probably," Caleb said. "Can I wave at her?" "She's in the hallway." "I can open the door." "Lily?" She looked up. Her expression was the one she used when she considered his reasoning inadequate, but was deciding whether it was worth arguing. "I'm just going to wave," she said. "Finish the rabbit chapter." She looked back down at the book with the theatrical resignation of the profoundly wronged. Caleb went back to looking at the brass hardware he'd laid out on the kitchen counter. He was cataloging which pieces needed replating and which could be cleaned and lacquered as they were. The footsteps in the hallway paused. Then there was a knock. Light, 2 taps. Lily's head came up immediately with the expression of someone who had just been proven correct. Caleb set down the hardware and opened the door. Victoria was in her work clothes, dark blazer, hair that had been up and was now half released, a laptop bag over one shoulder that looked heavy. She was holding a paper bag from a Thai place on West End that he knew from the smell. "I ordered too much," she said, "by accident." He looked at the bag, then at her. "That's a lot of food to order by accident." "I was distracted." She held it out. "You don't have to. It'll just go to waste." "We like Thai food," said Lily from the table, without looking up from her rabbit book, with the practiced casualness of someone who had absolutely been tracking this entire interaction and was now inserting herself surgically. Victoria looked past Caleb to where Lily was sitting. Something in her face did the thing it did. That brief, unguarded warmth that showed up specifically when Lily was in the equation. "Hi," she said. Lily looked up. "Hi." She considered Victoria with the frank assessment of an 8-year-old who was very interested in something but was trying to appear merely curious. "You have a really big camera bag. I've seen it." "I do. I take a lot of pictures." "Of what?" "Buildings, mostly, and sometimes people when they're not paying attention." Lily thought about this. "That's either photography or spying," she said with the tone of someone offering an even-handed analysis. "Lily," Caleb said. "What?" "It's both." Victoria was smiling in a way she wasn't controlling. "You're not wrong." Caleb stood aside. "Come in," he said the way he had 11 days ago in the same doorway under different circumstances that were somehow already starting to feel like a different era. They ate at the farm table. Victoria and Lily managed to have a conversation that went, in sequence, through the subjects of whether sparrows had personalities, the best method for drawing horses, Lily had opinions, whether working in a tall building was scary or exciting, Victoria said both, which Lily accepted as the correct answer, and what a CFO was, which Lily had heard Victoria use on a phone call in the hallway once and had been wondering about since. "Chief Financial Officer," Victoria said. "It means the person at a company who's in charge of all the money." "You're in charge of money?" Lily asked. "A lot of it." "Like, how much?" "Lily," Caleb said. "That's a fair question," Victoria said. She looked at Lily. "Enough that it's a lot of work to keep track of." My dad keeps track of money on the refrigerator, Lily said helpfully. With magnets. That's a valid system. He has a magnet that's a pineapple. Everyone needs a pineapple magnet, Lily nodded, satisfied. Then, are you going to eat with us again? Lily. Caleb's voice was even, but his daughter could hear the register in it. I'm just asking. Lily looked between them with the serene innocence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. We have extra chairs. Victoria looked at Caleb with the expression of someone who was working very hard not to fully smile. He shook his head slightly, which communicated nothing she was going to act on. I'd like that, Victoria said. If it's okay. It's okay, Lily said firmly, clearly not leaving the determination to her father. After dinner, Caleb put Lily through the bedtime rotation, which took 45 minutes and involved 2-story pages, a lengthy discussion of whether caterpillars dreamed, and one return trip for water that he was 90% sure was tactical, and came back to the kitchen to find Victoria had cleared the takeout containers and was standing at the counter with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she'd made herself, which was something she'd done without asking, which meant she'd been here enough times in her head to have gotten comfortable with it. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a second before she saw him. She was looking at the refrigerator, at the magnets and the utility bills he kept there and Lily's drawings, new ones since Saturday, a series of horses that had gotten increasingly abstract in a way he suspected was intentional, and the pineapple magnet and the photo strip from a booth at a state fair 2 summers ago where he and Lily were making faces in 3 out of 4 frames and looking directly at the camera in the 4th, with expressions of accidental sincerity. She was looking at it the way she'd looked at his apartment the very first time, trying to understand the logic. She's a good kid, Victoria said, without turning around. She'd heard him. She's a complicated kid, he said. Which is better? Victoria turned. She leaned her back against the counter. She asked me if I had a cat. Did she? She seemed disappointed that I didn't. She's been working on me for a cat for 8 months. She's expanding her strategy. Victoria's mouth curved. She looked down at the mug. The kitchen light was still too yellow. He still hadn't changed the bulb. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. She looked up. What are you doing with me? He stayed in the doorway. What do you mean? I mean... She paused, not searching for words but deciding which ones. You came to the brunch. You stood in that room. You said something true about me at the table and didn't want anything for it. You let me show up here with food on a Monday and eat dinner with your daughter. She held his gaze. You're not asking me for anything. You're not impressed by the wrong things. You're not trying to manage me or fix me or figure out what I can do for you. Another pause. I don't know what to do with someone who's just present. That's a strange thing not to know what to do with, he said. I know. She looked briefly frustrated with herself. I know it is. He moved into the kitchen and sat at the table. She stayed at the counter. It was the same configuration they'd had 11 days ago, which felt both like coincidence and not. I'm not doing anything with you, he said. I'm just here. That sounds simple. It is simple. Then why does it feel like something else? He thought about that for a moment, about the honest answer versus the careful one, and which one she'd actually trust. Because you've been in rooms where simple things had conditions on them, he said. You've been in enough situations where someone being kind wanted something for it, so you don't know how to take it when it doesn't. She was very quiet. That's not a criticism, he said. I know. She looked at the mug again. Damien said something to you. In the garden. I saw you two talking. He said you might confuse comfort with other things when you're vulnerable. She didn't react to hearing it confirmed. He said versions of that to me, about other people, other situations. He always says it with concern, like he's protecting me. She set the mug down on the counter. What he means is that my judgment can't be trusted when I'm not in a position of control. I figured. Did you believe him? The kitchen was quiet. Down the hall, Lily was asleep or close to it, the soft sounds of a small person in their correct place for the night. Outside, Nashville was doing its evening thing. For about 48 hours, he said honestly, not because I thought he was right, because the question underneath it was real. Which question? He looked at her steadily. Whether you knocked on my door because it was the nearest door or because it was mine. The silence after that had weight to it. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed off the counter and came to the table and sat down across from him, the same way she had that first night, and she put her hands flat on the table surface and looked at them. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay. I've walked past your door a lot of times. She kept her eyes on her hands. After board meetings that went wrong, after my mother called about Damien for the third time in a week, after a birthday dinner with my family where everyone was perfectly lovely, and I got home and sat in my penthouse for an hour feeling like a problem that everyone was trying to solve. She looked up. I've stood in this hallway and thought about knocking and then kept walking. That happened at least 6 times before Thursday. Caleb said nothing. The date wasn't what sent me to your door, she said. It was the thing that stopped me pretending I had a reason not to knock. She held his gaze. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. It makes sense. I'm not coming to you because things fall apart, she said. I'm not doing that. I've had people I went to when things fell apart, and they all wanted to be the solution, and I don't need a solution. She exhaled slowly. I come here because when I'm here, I can think straight. She pressed her lips together briefly. That's not a small thing for me. He thought about Dana telling him he was stable, how she'd meant it as a reason to stay and how it had ultimately been a reason to leave, because stability isn't enough on its own. You can stabilize something and still feel nothing for it. This didn't feel like that. He was fairly certain this didn't feel like that, but he was also a man who had sat alone in a too-quiet apartment for long enough that he knew how easily you could convince yourself you were seeing something that wasn't there. I hear you, he said. She waited. Is that all? No. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. But I need you to understand something too. Okay. I've spent 4 years being the reliable one, he said. Good father, good neighbor, pays his bills on time, shows up when you need help with something. That's all real. I mean it, it's not a performance. But reliable becomes its own trap after a while. People start to assume you'll be there regardless. And he stopped, found the right word. I've been taken for granted in ways I let happen because I thought that was what you did. You showed up. You were steady. You didn't make it about you. Caleb, I'm not saying you're doing that, he said. I'm saying I need to know the difference. For myself. She held his gaze. Her expression had something in it that was close to pain and not trying to hide it. What's the difference? She asked. How do I show you? You already are, he said, but I need to see it for longer than 2 weeks. She absorbed that. He watched her and thought about how she probably wasn't used to someone requiring time. He thought about how most people in her life either wanted something immediately or asked nothing at all. He thought about how time was probably the one thing she hadn't thought to offer. Okay, she said, quietly. Not defeated, just certain. He nodded, and for a while they sat at the farm table and talked about other things. A restoration project he had coming up, a photograph she'd taken that week of a fire escape on a building downtown that she kept looking at and not understanding why she liked it. And the conversation breathed normally and didn't require anything it wasn't ready for. She left at 9:45. He walked her to the elevator. The flickering light had been fixed sometime in the past week. Maintenance had finally come through, and the hallway looked somehow different in steady light. Better and more exposing at the same time. The light's fixed, she said. Yeah. It looks different. Everything looks different when you stop pretending the flaw's not there, he said. She looked at him. Is that another refrigerator magnet? Might be. Still not wrong. The elevator arrived. She stepped in and then turned, holding the doors. It was the same gesture as the first night, the same position, but something in it had changed, the way the same words mean different things when you know more about the person saying them. I'll see you, she said. Yeah, he said. You will. Cool. 3 weeks moved through the way weeks do when something is quietly accumulating. Victoria started knocking on Tuesdays. Not always, not as a rule, but often enough that Caleb started cooking a little more on Tuesday evenings without consciously deciding to. He told himself this was efficient. He was aware that this was not the real reason. Lily absorbed Victoria into the texture of the week with the unself-conscious ease of an 8-year-old who had decided she approved of something and saw no reason to make it complicated. She showed Victoria a watercolor she was working on, a horse, but an abstract one that Lily insisted was intentionally avant-garde in a word she'd gotten from her teacher. Victoria asked which direction the horse was running, and Lily said it wasn't running, it was thinking, and Victoria looked at it for a moment and said, "That's exactly right," in a way that wasn't patronizing, and Lily beamed with the total, unguarded satisfaction of someone who had been correctly understood. Caleb watched this from the kitchen doorway with the particular ache of a parent seeing his kid lit up by something and not being the one who lit it. One Tuesday, Victoria brought her camera. Not the professional one, a smaller thing, a film camera that she said she'd found at an estate sale and was still figuring out. "Can I take a picture of your table?" she asked. "The farm table?" "The light on it right now." "It's good." He looked at his kitchen table. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that made the wood surface, with its $40 estate sale history and its 3-weekend refinishing job and the small, circular mark from a hot mug he'd never managed to fully buff out, look genuinely beautiful in the way ordinary things sometimes look beautiful when the light hits them right and you're paying attention. "Sure," he said. She knelt beside it and shot from a low angle, and then stood and moved and shot from another angle with the focused quiet of someone who wasn't thinking about anything else. Lily appeared from the living room and watched with enormous interest. "Can you take a picture of Winston?" Lily asked. "Who's Winston?" "My grandmother's cat. He sat on my drawing. I need evidence." Victoria looked at Caleb. He shook his head slightly. She looked back at Lily. "I can take a picture of your drawing instead," she said. "Document the damage." Lily considered this strategic pivot. "That works." She photographed the drawing, a horse, with a crease across one corner that Lily said was from Winston, and that Caleb privately thought was from Lily's backpack. Victoria examined the damage with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Significant," she said. "That's what I said," Lily agreed. Later, after Lily was in bed, Victoria sat at the kitchen table and pulled the camera onto the table and wound the film advance with a small mechanical click. "I don't know if any of them will come out," she said. "Film is unforgiving. Is that good or bad?" "Both." She set the camera down. "I've been shooting digital for 3 years because digital lets you take 100 pictures and pick the one that works. Film makes you wait. You don't know what you have until it's developed." She turned the camera over in her hands. "I think I needed to remember what that felt like." Waiting? Not knowing. She looked at him. Living with the uncertainty of not being able to see it immediately. He thought that was probably about more than photography. He didn't say so because she knew it was too, and saying so would have made it smaller than it was. "I'm having dinner at my mother's next Saturday," she said. "The engagement dinner, more formal than the brunch. All the extended family, business associates, the people who've known my mother for 30 years. She paused. "Damien will be there." "Okay." "My mother specifically told me to bring whoever I wanted." Victoria's voice was careful. She said it pointedly, which with my mother means the opposite of whatever the words are. She means bring Damien. She means don't embarrass her. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" She looked at him. "I want you there." "As what?" The question again, the same one from the car on the way to the brunch, asked differently now. The week of the brunch, it had been a question about roles and logistics. 3 weeks later, it was something else. She held his gaze for long enough that the answer wasn't really a question anymore. "As yourself," she said. "Just as yourself." He thought about stability and being chosen, about the difference between a harbor and a destination, about a woman who'd stood outside his door 6 times before she knocked, which was its own kind of answer if you knew how to read it. He thought about what he'd told her. "I need to see it for longer than 2 weeks." It had been 3 weeks. "Okay," he said. She exhaled. Not relieved, settled, like something had found the place it was supposed to be. They sat at the table until past 10, and the conversation moved through different rooms the way it always did. His work, her work, the fire escape photograph she still didn't understand why she liked, a book Lily had recommended to Victoria with great authority, the film camera, and what it might or might not have captured. Outside, the city did its thing. Inside, the too yellow light made everything look the color of late afternoons, of wooden things with histories, of ordinary evenings that had quietly become something worth being present for. At 10:15, she stood and gathered her camera. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. Before Thursday. She was standing with the camera in her hands, and she looked like herself, but not compressed, not managing the room, just the version of her that existed in his kitchen at 10 o'clock on a weeknight. "Before the disastrous date, before any of this, did you—" She stopped. "Did I what?" She looked at him. She was doing that thing again where she was deciding how much to give. "Did you know?" she said finally. "That I wanted to knock." He looked at her for a long moment. The camera in her hands, the light on her face, the question underneath the question, which was, "Did I make sense to you even before you knew me, or did I only become something when I showed up at your door and gave you the chance?" "I noticed when you were in the hallway," he said. "I noticed every time." She held his gaze. Something in her face moved, not quite undone, not quite certain, but somewhere honest in between. "Good night," she said. "Night." He walked her to the elevator. The hall was quiet and steady lit. She stepped in, turned around. And for the first time, she didn't hold the door while she looked at him. She just looked, the door still open, and he looked back. And it was the kind of moment that doesn't need anything added to it and is ruined by explanation. The doors closed. He stood in the hallway and breathed. Down the hall, faintly, the sound of Lily shifting in her sleep and then settling again. The small unconscious sounds of a person in the right place at the right time, without needing to think about it. He went back inside, stood in the kitchen, didn't touch the kettle. Saturday was 6 days away, and he was going to walk into Eleanor Ashcroft's world again. And Damien Holloway was going to be in that room, and every person there was going to look at him and see what he wasn't before they saw what he was. He knew that. He was clear on that. He was going anyway. Not because she needed him, not because he was the closest door or the safe option or the reliable choice that became invisible the moment the crisis passed. He was going because she'd stood outside his door 6 times and finally knocked, and he'd been counting the ways that mattered ever since. The 6 days between Tuesday evening and Saturday dinner moved the way time moves when you're waiting for something you haven't decided how to feel about yet. Simultaneously, too fast and too slow, each day carrying a low-grade awareness that something was coming that would require more than he usually brought to things. Caleb worked. That was what he did when things accumulated in his head. He worked with his hands until the accumulation quieted, or at least organized itself into something manageable. He finished the Victorian writing desk for the Vanderbilt professor, who came by Thursday afternoon and stood in his studio doorway looking at the restored piece with the expression of someone seeing a thing return to what it had always been supposed to be. She paid him, and shook his hand and said she'd been worried he wouldn't be able to save it, and he said the bones were good, which was true, and which was usually the thing that determined whether something was worth saving in the first place. He started a new project Friday, a mid-century dresser someone had found in a storage unit that had been painted over approximately 4 times with colors that had no relationship to each other or to anything the piece wanted to be. He spent the day stripping it down to bare wood, which was satisfying in the specific way of removing things that shouldn't have been added. By evening, he had the dresser down to its original walnut, and it was better than he'd expected. Under 4 layers of wrong choices, it had been fine all along. Lily noticed he was quieter than usual on Friday night. She noticed things with the attentiveness of a child who'd spent enough time in a 2-person household to understand that her father's silences had different qualities, the way weather has different qualities, even when it all technically counts as overcast. "Are you worried about something?" she asked at dinner. She was eating macaroni with the focused efficiency of someone who had places to be, which she did not, but she approached all meals that way. "No," he said. She looked at him. "Not worried," he revised. "Thinking." "About the furniture lady?" He looked up. "She's not the furniture lady. She takes pictures of furniture. You fix furniture." Lily shrugged with the philosophical ease of someone who considered this a reasonable taxonomy. It fits. Her name is Victoria. I know her name. Lily twirled macaroni with the precision of someone who'd been working on her fork technique. She's nice. She listened to my whole horse thing. The avant-garde horse. It has emotional depth, Lily said, with a gravity that suggested she was serious and also completely aware of how serious she was being about a watercolor. She did listen, Caleb said. Most grown-ups pretend to listen, Lily said. She actually did. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, gap-toothed, already very clear about the difference between performed attention and real attention, and thought that she had probably figured out the important thing before he had. Yeah, he said. She does. Lily went back to her macaroni satisfied. You should wear the gray shirt again, she said. What? When you see her, you look like yourself in the gray shirt. She said it with complete practicality, like she was giving him maintenance advice. The navy one makes you look like you're trying. He sat with that for a moment. When did you become an expert on this? He asked. She shrugged again. I pay attention. She did. That was the thing about Lily. She always had. He wore the gray shirt. Marcus picked him up at 6:45, which was what Victoria had arranged, and Caleb came down to the lobby to find her already there, which she hadn't been the morning of the brunch. She was standing near the glass doors looking at something on her phone, and she was wearing something dark, deep burgundy, structured at the shoulders, the kind of dress that said, "This is a formal occasion," without announcing it. Her hair was entirely up this time, small earrings he hadn't seen before. She put the phone away when she saw him. She looked at the gray shirt, and something moved through her expression briefly. Good shirt, she said. I've been told. Marcus held the car door. They got in. The evening Nashville outside was doing what Nashville evenings did in early fall. That particular amber light that made everything look like the ending of something, which was either melancholy or beautiful depending on what you were carrying. Tell me what tonight is, Caleb said. Victoria looked at him. What do you mean? At the brunch you wanted someone in the room who saw things clearly. What do you want tonight? She was quiet for a moment, watching the city go by. He noticed she was holding her phone in her lap without looking at it, which for her was the equivalent of most people's visible nervousness. My mother called me Wednesday, she said. She said she was glad I'd found a friend in the building. The word friend came out with a precise flatness that communicated exactly what Eleanor had intended by it. She also mentioned that Damien had talked to her after the brunch. She didn't tell me what he said. She didn't need to. He's been building a case, Caleb said. He's been building a case since the day I didn't call him after the first date 2 years ago. She shifted slightly. Damien doesn't lose gracefully. He redirects. He finds the angle that lets him frame the situation as something other than losing. She looked at Caleb steadily. Tonight, he's going to try to make you into the proof of something. Proof of what? That I'm impulsive. That I make decisions from emotion rather than judgment. That I've attached myself to someone unsuitable because I was having a bad night, and that the people who care about me need to help me see that. She said it without drama, the way you describe weather. He'll do it graciously. He won't be rude to you. He's too smart to be rude to you. Caleb looked at the passing streets. He thought about the garden conversation, about Damien's practiced concern, about the way he'd said she can confuse comfort with other things, as if it were reluctant honesty rather than strategy. What do you want to do about it? He asked. She turned to look at him fully. In the car's low light, with the city going amber outside, she looked tired and certain in the same measure, which he was starting to understand was her natural state, always carrying more than she showed, always more resolved than the weight suggested she should be. I want to stop managing it, she said. I've been managing how I'm perceived in that room since I was 24 years old. Every dinner, every family event, every conversation with my mother where I have to decide which version of myself is least likely to become the evening's project. She held his gaze. I'm tired of it. I want to just be there. Say what's true. Let it be what it is. That's going to make people uncomfortable. I know. Including your mother. Especially my mother. A pause. But Sophie's getting married, and there are going to be years of these dinners ahead of me, and I don't want to spend all of them being the version of myself that's most convenient for everyone else. He thought about the farm table and the crooked bookshelves, and his daughter telling him he looked like himself in the gray shirt. He thought about how the most ordinary things could be the most honest things, and how honesty was not actually comfortable. It was just better than the alternative in the long run. "Okay," he said, "you keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, then looked back at the window, and he saw the slight shift in her shoulders that was her setting something down that she'd been carrying. But Eleanor Ashcroft's house at night was different from Eleanor Ashcroft's house in the morning. The same cream stone, the same black-green door, but lit from within in a way that made it look like an institution for the preservation of a particular way of life. Cars lined the drive. More than the brunch, this was a larger gathering, the full formal weight of the occasion assembled. Inside, the house had been rearranged for the event. The dining room table had been extended to seat 22. Caleb counted the chairs the way he counted things he'd been doing this since he was a kid, and still didn't know why. The centerpiece was elaborate without being fussy. Someone had thought carefully about it, and then pretended they hadn't. Eleanor received them near the entrance with the composure of a woman in complete command of her environment. She kissed Victoria's cheek, held both her hands for a moment, said something quiet that Caleb wasn't meant to hear. Then she turned to him with her calibrated smile. "Caleb, we're so glad you could join us again." It was perfectly warm and completely opaque. "Thank you, Mrs. Ashcroft. The house is beautiful." "Eleanor, please." She touched his arm briefly, the social gesture of inclusion, and moved away toward the next arrivals with the practiced ease of someone conducting an orchestra that was also a dinner party. Sophie appeared from the living room side and hugged Victoria with genuine relief, the way you hug someone when you've needed them in the room and they've finally arrived. She shook Caleb's hand warmly. "Griffin's stuck talking to my Uncle Richard about interest rates," she said in a low voice. "Please go save him." "Which Uncle Richard?" Caleb said. "The one who asked what you did at the brunch," Victoria said. "There are two of them?" Caleb asked. "Twins?" Sophie said with the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime explaining this. "Identical. One asks about money, one asks about politics. The money one has the watch." "Got it?" "You don't have to save Griffin," Victoria said. "I don't mind," Caleb said. And he meant it, because crossing a room to rescue someone from a conversation about interest rates was considerably more comfortable than standing in the entrance being calibrated by Eleanor Ashcroft. He found Griffin near the fireplace with Uncle Richard, the one with the watch, and a man he didn't recognize who was nodding with the expression of someone who'd been nodding for approximately 15 minutes. Caleb joined them, asked about the watch. An Omega, 1968, genuinely beautiful. And Richard spent the next 10 minutes talking about it with an enthusiasm that was the first authentic thing Caleb had seen from him. Griffin caught Caleb's eye and mouthed "thank you" with the unguarded sincerity of a man who had been talking about interest rates for longer than any person should have to. They moved to the table at 7:30. Caleb found his place card between Sophie's friend, a woman named Andrea, who designed interiors and was interested in the furniture restoration in a way that was professional rather than polite, and a man named Whitfield, who ran something in private equity and spent most of the first course talking across Caleb to Andrea. That was fine. Caleb ate and listened and watched the room. Damien was seated near the other end of the table, near Eleanor, which was not an accident. He was in his natural element, formal dinner, aligned allies, home territory. He had the easy confidence of a man playing on his best court. He talked to Eleanor with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood that in this room Eleanor was the governing factor. Victoria was across the table and 4 seats down from Caleb. He could see her clearly. He watched her through the first course being navigated by people on both sides who were conducting the particular kind of social pressure that doesn't look like pressure from outside. The question that implies a right answer, the observation that requires a specific response to avoid giving offense. She handled it with the compressed grace he recognized, taking up less space than she needed. He watched her and he thought, this is what she's been doing every time. Every dinner, every event, Every room where the version of her that was most convenient got assembled by other people before she'd said a word. The second course arrived. The wine had been refreshed. Conversations at the table had started to cross and combine the way they do when a group of people have been fed enough and drunk enough to become less structured in their social geometry. Then Damien, from his end of the table, said, "Victoria, I was talking to your board member David Chen at the end of last quarter. He mentioned you're looking at an expansion into European markets." The table didn't exactly go quiet, but conversations adjusted, calibrated, tuned in the way people at a dinner table tune in when someone puts something in the center that's going to become the main thing. Victoria looked at Damien. Her expression was composed. "We're assessing it," she said. "Nothing's confirmed." "It's ambitious," Damien said, and his tone was admiring in the way that contained its opposite. "You've always been ambitious. It's one of the things I find most—" He paused, chose. "Impressive." "Thank you," Victoria said flatly. "The European market is complicated right now," said Whitfield from 2 seats down Caleb's side, picking up the thread with the enthusiasm of someone who knew this topic. "Post-Brexit fragmentation, the regulatory environment—" "Victoria knows the European regulatory environment," Eleanor said from the head of the table, which was defense wrapped in assertion, which was its own complicated thing. "Of course," Damien said smoothly, "which is exactly why I think it would benefit from the right kind of partnership. Someone who has those relationships established already." He smiled at the table. "It's not a criticism, it's just that some opportunities require a particular kind of infrastructure." The implication was clear enough without being stated, which was how Damien always worked. He was describing himself as the infrastructure. He was describing Victoria's company as something that needed him, framed as care. Victoria set her fork down, not loudly, just down. "Damien," she said, and her voice was entirely even, "which of your relationships in European markets are you referring to specifically?" He smiled. "The Hartwell Group primarily, and I have connections through the Meridian Fund that—" "The Hartwell Group withdrew from 3 of their continental positions last year," she said, "and Meridian's European Fund has been underperforming its benchmark for 6 consecutive quarters." She picked up her wine glass. "I know because I follow it. I follow everything in my sector." She held his gaze steadily. "I appreciate the thought, but I don't need the infrastructure." A brief, charged silence. Whitfield, beside Caleb, made a small sound that might have been surprise or might have been appreciation. Andrea had gone still in the attentive way of someone watching something resolve. Eleanor said, "More wine?" to the table at large, which was her version of turning a page. Damien smiled without tightening. He was good. He recovered without appearing to recover. "Fair enough," he said, and lifted his own glass slightly. "I stand corrected." But he wasn't done. Caleb could see that from across the table. The correction was tactical. Cede the business ground, regroup on different terrain. Or so. The terrain shifted after dinner. They moved to the sitting room for dessert and coffee, the gathering becoming less structured, people drifting into smaller clusters. The formal seating had dissolved. Caleb found himself near the fireplace with Sophie and Griffin and a couple from Sophie's side that he hadn't met. Warm people, easy to talk to, the kind who asked questions and listened to the answers. He was aware, at the edge of his attention, of where Victoria was. She was near the window with her mother and a woman he didn't know, and he could read from her posture that the conversation was the kind she was managing rather than having. Damien appeared at Caleb's side with the relaxed confidence of a man approaching something he'd already decided. "Good dinner," Damien said. "It was," Caleb agreed. They stood near the fireplace. The couple had drifted away toward the dessert table. Sophie had pulled Griffin by the hand to introduce him to someone. Caleb and Damien were briefly alone in a corner of the room, which had the quality of something arranged, even if it wasn't. "She's remarkable," Damien said. He said it looking across the room toward Victoria, which was the move you made when you wanted to establish common ground. "She is," Caleb said. "I've known her 2 years." Damien turned slightly, including Caleb in the conversation's orbit. "She's complicated, in the way that people with real intelligence and real pressure are complicated. She doesn't always know what she needs." "She knows exactly what she needs," Caleb said. "She just doesn't always get to have it." Damien looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. He'd expected something else: defensiveness or deference, or the uncertainty of a man who knew he was out of his social weight class. He hadn't expected clarity. "You've known her how long?" Damien asked. "A month?" "About that. And in a month you think you know what she needs." "I think she knows what she needs," Caleb said. "I think she's told you that in various ways, and you've heard it as instability rather than information." Something shifted in Damien's face. Not anger, something more considered than anger. The expression of a man who was deciding whether to engage honestly or strategically and was taking a moment to make the call. He went strategic. "I think you're a decent man," Damien said, and he meant to be kind, which made it worse. "I genuinely think that. And I think Victoria is someone who generates attachment, strong feeling. She does it without trying. She's in a difficult place with her family, her company, and you happened to be there when she needed somewhere to put that." He looked directly at Caleb. "I'm not saying this to diminish you. I'm saying it because someone should be honest about what's actually happening here before feelings get more complicated." The room moved around them. Conversations, laughter, the clink of dessert forks. Eleanor's house doing what it was built to do. Caleb let the speech arrive and settle, and then he said, "You've said a version of that to me twice now, and to her more times than that. I think you believe it." He looked at Damien steadily. "But I also think you've confused two things. You think I'm here because she's vulnerable. The truth is, she's not vulnerable. She's decided. And that's the part you can't accept." Damien was very still for a moment. "She hasn't said anything to me," he started. "She doesn't owe you a speech," Caleb said. "She doesn't owe you an explanation, or a formal declaration, or the chance to make a counter-argument." He kept his voice level. "She went to dinner with you, she was honest about how it felt, and she moved on. That's its own kind of clear communication." The fireplace was warm. Somewhere across the room, Sophie laughed at something Griffin had said. Her real laugh, the one that didn't perform anything. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he'd expected to find in Caleb, uncertainty, defensiveness, the specific vulnerability of a man who knew he was out of place, wasn't there, and the absence of it required him to reassemble his understanding of the situation. "You're very certain," Damien said. "No," Caleb said. "I'm honest. There's a difference." Damien nodded slowly, and then he did something that Caleb hadn't expected. He said, "I hear you," without the strategic overlay, without the gracious armor. And for a second, he looked like someone who was tired and had been carrying something for 2 years and had just been told it was going to stay heavy. Then he excused himself and moved back into the room, and that was the conversation. Caleb was at the dessert table, not eating dessert, but standing near it, because it was a good place to observe the room when he felt Victoria beside him. He hadn't seen her cross the room. "What happened over there?" she asked quietly. "We talked." "What did he say?" "Same thing as always, different words." She was quiet for a moment, reading his face. "And?" "And I told him you weren't vulnerable, you were decided." He glanced at her. "I probably shouldn't have said that for you." "No," she said, and her voice had something in it. You were right to say it. Victoria." Eleanor Ashcroft appeared from the side of the room with the timing of someone who had been waiting for an opening and had decided this was it. She looked between them with an expression that had resolved, in the past hour, from cordial ambiguity to something more direct. "May I speak with you a moment? And Caleb, you as well, if you don't mind." They followed her to the small sitting room off the hallway, which Eleanor used as a place for conversations that needed 4 walls. Eleanor closed the door. She stood in front of them with her hands clasped in front of her, and for the first time all evening she looked less like a woman managing a room and more like a woman who was about to say something she'd thought about for a while. "I'm not going to do the thing I was planning to do," she said. Caleb and Victoria both waited. "I was going to make this a conversation about the family's expectations and what's appropriate and what I think Victoria needs in terms of a partner," Eleanor said. "I've been planning it since Wednesday. Damien gave me enough information to feel justified in having it." She looked at Victoria directly. "But I've been watching you tonight." Victoria said nothing. At the table, when Damien did his positioning, You didn't perform anything. You just told him the truth about his information and moved on. Eleanor paused. I have not seen you do that at this table in 10 years. Not since before you took over the company. Eleanor, Victoria started. I'm talking, her mother said, not unkindly. I'm doing a thing where I'm saying something I should have said earlier and I need to finish it. Victoria closed her mouth. Eleanor looked at Caleb. He held her gaze without flinching, which appeared to be what she required of him. I don't know you, she said. I've met you twice at family events and I've formed impressions that are probably incomplete. What I see is someone who is plainly not from this world. She said it without apology or malice, just accuracy. And who appears to make my daughter comfortable in a way that doesn't make her smaller. She paused. Damien makes her smaller. I've seen it happening for 2 years and I chose not to see it because his family is appropriate and his resume is appropriate and he knows which fork to use. The room was quiet enough that they could hear, distantly, Sophie laughing in the sitting room. I am asking you, Eleanor said to Caleb, to be clear with me about what your intentions are, because she is my daughter. And whatever else I've gotten wrong about this, I have never been careless about her. The room held still. Caleb looked at Eleanor Ashcroft, 60 years old, iron-composed, standing in her own house asking a question she clearly found uncomfortable to ask, and respected her for it. I don't know exactly where this is going, he said. I can't tell you I have a plan or a timeline or something that fits neatly into any category you'd recognize. He kept his voice even. What I can tell you is that I've spent the last month trying to understand the difference between being someone she comes to and being someone she chooses, and I'm paying close attention to that difference, because I've been on the wrong side of it before, and I'm not interested in repeating it. He held Eleanor's gaze. I think she's exceptional. I think she knows it and doesn't quite believe it in the rooms where it should matter most. And I think the fact that you're having this conversation right now instead of the one you planned is a better sign about you than you're giving yourself credit for. Silence. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Victoria. Something moved through her face that was complicated and old, and not something that could be resolved in one evening in a side room at a dinner party. You should have brought him to Sunday dinners 2 years ago, Eleanor said, instead of Damien. Mother, I'm not being sentimental. I'm being accurate. Eleanor unclenched her hands. This is not a blessing or a declaration. It is me saying that I see what I see and I am adjusting accordingly. She said it the way she would say anything, practically, without embellishment. Now, both of you go back in there and have dessert. Sophie is watching the door, and she's not subtle about it. She moved past them and opened the side room door and walked back into her own party with the composure of a woman who had handled the things she'd come to handle. Through the open door, Sophie, who was indeed watching from across the hallway, gave Victoria a look that communicated an entire paragraph. Victoria returned a look that communicated a shorter one. They went back to the party. By 9:30, the dinner was winding toward its natural end. People were finding coats, exchanging specific plans to make general plans, saying the things that people say at the end of events. The house was beginning to re-emerge from underneath the evening. Damien left early. He said his goodbyes with characteristic grace, kissed Eleanor's cheek, shook Griffin's hand. He paused at Victoria on his way out and said something quiet. She listened, nodded once. He looked briefly at Caleb across the room, not with hostility, not with defeat, but with the particular expression of a man recategorizing something in his understanding of a situation. And then he left. What did he say? Caleb asked when she came back to his side. He said he hoped I was happy. A pause. I think he meant it. I think he did too. She was quiet for a moment. He's not a bad person. No. He's just been trying to solve the wrong problem for 2 years. She looked at the door through which he'd just exited. He thought I needed someone to manage what I had. What I actually needed was someone to stop treating what I have as the main thing about me. Caleb thought about furniture under 4 layers of paint, about things that are better than expected when you get down to what they actually are. Eleanor caught his eye from across the room as they were preparing to leave. She nodded once, just slightly. It was the smallest possible gesture. It communicated something he'd need to think about later. Sophie hugged Victoria for a long time at the door. Over Victoria's shoulder, she looked at Caleb and smiled. Not the knowing look from the brunch, but something warmer and more real. She's been needing this for a long time, Sophie said to him, directly, like he'd earned the direct version. I think so, he said. Don't make her wait too much longer, Sophie said. Not as a warning, as information. Griffin shook his hand again, solidly, briefly, and that was the end of the goodbyes. Marcus was at the curb. The night was cool now, Nashville fall making itself known. Victoria exhaled when they got to the car, a long, slow breath that she'd probably been holding since 6:45. They rode back in the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. The city went by. The amber light was gone. Nighttime Nashville, lit differently, more honest about what it was. Your mother surprised me, he said eventually. She surprised me too. Victoria was looking out the window. She's not going to be easy. This isn't her turning into someone different. She's still going to have opinions, and she's still going to manage things, and she's still going to call me about the company. I know. But she heard something tonight, and she adjusted. She paused. That's actually rare for her. You gave her something worth adjusting to. She turned from the window and looked at him. In the car's dark, with the city lights moving across her face, she looked like herself in a way that was different from all the other versions of herself he'd been watching navigate other people's rooms all evening. Not compressed, not managing, just there. Thank you, she said. For what specifically? For not trying to win anything tonight. She held his gaze. Damien always tries to win. Every conversation, every room. Even when he's being gracious, he's winning something. She shook her head slightly. You're not doing that. I'm not interested in winning, he said. I'm interested in what's actually true. She looked at him for a long moment. The car moved through the night. What's actually true, she said quietly, almost to herself, like she was taking the measure of the phrase. The Whitmore came into view. Marcus turned and slowed, and the car came to the curb. The city was ordinary around them. A guy walking a dog, a lit window on the second floor of the building across the street, someone's music from a car turning at the corner. They walked into the lobby. The elevator opened without waiting this time. Inside, the car moved upward, and at 4, the doors opened, and this time Victoria stepped out with him. He looked at her. She looked back. I'm not going upstairs yet, she said simply. He held the elevator door for a second, then let it go. They stood in the hallway, the same hallway with the light that was fixed now, the floor that was slightly uneven near the far end, the building's old bones around them. Come inside, Jamal, he said. Not a question. Yeah, she said. They went inside. The kitchen light was still too yellow. He'd bought a new bulb 2 weeks ago and left it on the counter and kept forgetting to change it. And right now at 10:15 on a Saturday night, it was throwing its familiar amber over everything. The farm table, the countertops, Victoria sitting in the chair she'd started to occupy the way you occupy a place you've been enough times to have a place in it. He made tea without asking. Chamomile, same as the first night, and he was aware of the symmetry without making it into something. She'd taken off her heels at the door. She was sitting with her feet tucked under her in the chair, a position she'd arrived at gradually over the weeks, the way you gradually stop performing comfort and start actually having it. And she was looking at her hands. Your mother said something to me before we left, Caleb said from the kitchen, when you were saying goodbye to Sophie. Victoria looked up. What did she say? She said, he paused, getting the kettle. She said that you've been running that company since you were 24, and she's spent 10 years being more impressed by it than she's told you. The silence after that had weight. She said that? Victoria's voice was careful, the way it got careful when something had gotten through the part of her that usually managed what got through. Those were pretty close to her exact words. He brought the mugs to the table and sat down. I think she's been carrying that for a while and decided tonight was the night to put it down. Victoria looked at the mug in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it the way she always did, and for a moment she didn't say anything, and Caleb didn't fill the silence because some silences were doing necessary work, and interrupting them was the wrong move. She's never said that, Victoria said finally. Not once, not in 10 years. I know. She said I work too much and I'm too serious and I should think about what I want beyond the company. A pause. She said the company is impressive. She said my father would be proud, but she's never said that She stopped. That she is, Caleb finished. Victoria pressed her lips together briefly. It was the expression she had when something was trying to get out that she hadn't fully prepared to let out. She's not an easy woman to love, she said. She never has been. She loves through management. She loves through trying to make everything go the right way, which mostly means her way, which she has convinced herself is the same thing as the right way. She looked up. But she loves. I've always known she loves. I've just spent 20 years wishing the love felt less like a board meeting. Tonight felt different, Caleb said. Tonight felt different, she agreed. She looked at him across the table. The yellow light between them, the mugs, the table's old surface that he'd spent 3 weekends on, and that still had the circular mark from a hot mug that had never quite buffed out. The apartment was its ordinary self around them. Crooked bookshelves, Lily's horse drawings on the refrigerator in their evolving avant-garde series, the faint permanent smell of wood and work that had soaked into the walls over 4 years. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Yeah." She held his gaze steadily. "That first night, when I knocked," she paused. "You opened the door and you saw me standing there in bare feet with mascara coming off, and you stepped back and said, 'Come in,' just like that." She searched his face. "Why?" He thought about it. The real answer, not the easy one. "Because you looked like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to put it down somewhere," he said. "And my door was where you put it down. I wasn't going to make you pick it back up." She was very still. "That's it?" she said. "No calculation, no wondering what it meant or what you were getting into." "There was wondering," he said. "There was plenty of wondering, but the wondering came after. In the moment, it was just, you were there, and the door was open." She looked at him for a long time with that expression he'd catalogued over weeks. The one that wasn't performing anything, that was just her, in the undivided version that she didn't give most rooms. He'd learned to recognize it, and had never once taken it for granted, which he thought was maybe the most important thing he'd managed in recent memory. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay?" "I told you I knocked on your door because the date stopped me from pretending I didn't want to." She turned the mug in her hands. "That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He waited. "The whole truth is that I've been afraid," she said. The word came out like she'd been holding it at arm's length and had finally let it land. "Not of you specifically, of this. Of wanting something that doesn't fit into a category I can manage. I know how to run a company. I know how to sit in a room full of people who think they know better than me and make them reconsider. I know how to be competent." She looked at him. "I don't know how to want something and not have a strategy for it. I don't know how to just feel something and let it exist without immediately trying to figure out what to do with it." "That sounds exhausting," he said. "It is." Her voice was dry and real at the same time. "It's genuinely exhausting." "You don't have to have a strategy for this," he said. "I know that intellectually. How about the other way?" She looked at him. "I'm working on it." He nodded, drank his coffee. The apartment held them both in its ordinary yellow light, and he thought about how the most important conversations of his life had all happened in kitchens, which was probably not a coincidence because kitchens were where people stopped performing and started just being people who needed to eat something and sit down. "I was afraid too," he said. She looked up. "Not the same way." He turned his mug on the table's surface. "I was afraid of being the closest door. I've been that before. The reliable one, the steady one, the person someone comes to when things are hard and leaves when things get better. I know how that goes." He met her eyes. "So I was watching. That's the honest version of these past weeks. I was watching to see if you'd still knock when things were okay, when there wasn't a crisis, when you didn't need something fixed." She was quiet for a moment. "And?" "You knocked on a Tuesday because you ordered too much Thai food," he said. "You knocked another time because you wanted to show Lily the film camera. You texted me about the sparrow." He paused. "You don't need a reason anymore. You just knock." Something moved through her face. Not tears, not quite, but the thing that lives right next to tears when the thing that's true finally gets said out loud. I just knock, she said softly. Yeah. She put the mug down and looked at the table for a moment. He could see her doing the thing she did, thinking through something, not to plan it, just to understand it. Then she looked up at him with the directness that was maybe the thing he'd noticed first about her, back when she was just the woman on 12, who passed him in the hallway and made eye contact like she actually meant to. I want to stop being careful, she said. With you. I've been careful because I didn't want to get it wrong. I didn't want to be the person who knocked on a man's door at midnight and then made it into something he didn't sign up for. A breath. But I think the careful is getting in the way of the actual thing. What's the actual thing? He said, quietly. She held his gaze. I'm in love with you, she said. I've probably been in love with you since before I was willing to admit I knew which door was yours. The kitchen was entirely still. He looked at her across the farm table, the one he'd found for $40 and spent 3 weekends on because some things were worth the work. And he felt the thing in his chest that had been there since the first night settle into something that finally had a name and wasn't afraid of its own name. I know, he said. She blinked. You know? I've known for a while. He watched her face. I was waiting for you to know. A sound came out of her that was somewhere between exasperated and undone. You were waiting. You needed the time. You could have said something. You would have talked yourself out of it, he said. If I'd said something before you got there yourself, you would have found 12 reasons why you'd read it wrong, or why it was too fast, or why the power dynamic was complicated, or that's... She stopped. That's accurate, and I resent it. He almost smiled. I know. She shook her head slightly, and the gesture was so unguarded, so genuinely her without any of the layers, that he felt it somewhere specific. She looked at him, and she wasn't performing anything, and she wasn't managing anything, and she wasn't taking up less space than she needed. So, she said. So, he said. She stood up from the chair, and he stood up from his, which was what happened, and they were both standing on the same side of the table and not sure exactly when they'd moved to the same side of the table. And he put his hand against her face, his thumb at her jaw, and she put her hand over his, and they stood like that for a second in the yellow light of his kitchen with the city outside doing its own thing entirely. Then he kissed her. Or she kissed him. Later, if anyone had asked, neither of them would have been able to say with certainty who had started it, which was probably the right way for things like that to happen. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was the kind of kiss that happens between two people who have been accumulating toward each other for months and have finally stopped finding reasons not to. A little uncertain at first, and then not uncertain at all. And it lasted long enough that when they stopped, they were both slightly different versions of themselves than they'd been going in. She pressed her forehead against his. He kept his hand at her jaw. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. She laughed. That real one, the surprised one, the one that came out when she wasn't trying to contain anything. He felt it against his chest and thought, there it is. That's the thing. That's exactly the thing. The weeks that followed were not perfect. Nothing worth having ever is. Victoria's company entered a complicated quarter in October. A potential acquisition she'd been tracking for 18 months hit regulatory friction and required her to be on calls at 6 in the morning and in meetings until 9 at night for 2 weeks straight. She was exhausted in a way that made her shorter than she wanted to be, and twice she snapped at Caleb over things that had nothing to do with him and knew it immediately and said so, which was harder than not snapping would have been, and he accepted the apology without making her pay for it more than once. He had his own hard stretch in November, a client dispute over a chair restoration that had gone sideways through no real fault of his, but that cost him money he'd been counting on and sent him into 3 days of the particular brooding that Lily called his furniture face, which she used as a diagnostic and was not wrong about. Victoria noticed. She didn't try to solve it. She showed up on a Tuesday with Thai food and sat at the table and asked him to walk her through exactly what had happened and listen through the whole thing without offering anything except her actual attention, which was what he needed, and what she'd learned was not the same as advice. They were learning each other. That's the honest description of those months. Not falling, but they'd already fallen, that had happened gradually, and then all at once in the way things do. What they were doing now was the harder, slower, more important work of learning each other's actual shapes. The edges, the sore spots, the ways that two people who have each spent years being essentially alone in their own way have to slowly expand to include another person without losing what they'd built in the solitude. Lily was, characteristically, the most direct about it. One Saturday morning in November, she came into the kitchen to find Victoria at the counter making coffee. Something she'd started doing with the ease of someone who knew where things were, which she did. And Caleb at the table with the newspaper, and the tableau of the morning was so ordinary that Lily stood in the kitchen doorway and regarded it for a moment. "Are you guys together now?" she asked. The question had the quality of a status update request, purely informational. Caleb and Victoria looked at each other. "Yes," Victoria said. "Okay." Lily moved to the refrigerator and assessed its contents with the thoroughness of a small person with significant breakfast opinions. "Are we going to get a cat?" "Lily," Caleb said, "it's a related question." "It's not related. If Victoria's going to be here a lot," Lily pulled out the orange juice, "and she likes cats." "I didn't say I liked cats," Victoria said. "You didn't say you didn't." Victoria looked at Caleb. He looked back with the expression of a man who had been having this argument for 8 months and was prepared to continue having it indefinitely. "I think cats are fine," Victoria said carefully. "That's basically yes," Lily said, pouring juice with great satisfaction. "That's not basically yes," Caleb said. Lily carried her juice to the table and sat down and looked at both of them with the calm authority of someone who had gotten what she needed from the exchange. "I'm going to name him Sparrow," she said. "We're not getting a cat," Caleb said. "Not yet," Lily said pleasantly, and opened her avant-garde horse sketchbook and began drawing. Victoria pressed her mouth together hard, and her shoulders were shaking, and Caleb looked at her and said, "Don't," in a tone that communicated that encouraging Lily was the single most dangerous thing she could do right now, and Victoria held it together for approximately 4 more seconds before she laughed, and then Lily laughed because Victoria was laughing, and then Caleb sat at his own kitchen table and looked at the two of them and felt something so uncomplicated and complete that he didn't have a word for it and didn't need one. Eleanor called Victoria in December. It wasn't the first call since the dinner. They'd talked several times, careful conversations that were rebuilding towards something neither of them had quite named yet. But this one was different. Victoria took it in the hallway outside Caleb's apartment while he was inside making dinner, and he could hear the murmur of her voice through the door, not the words, just the rhythm. And the rhythm was different from how she'd sounded in his hallway 3 months ago, less braced, less managing. She came back in after 20 minutes and sat at the table and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "She wants to have dinner," Victoria said. "Just the two of us. Next week." "Okay," Caleb said from the stove. "Not a family event. Not Sophie and Griffin, not a reason, just dinner." She paused. "She said she'd been thinking about what you said at the dinner about her adjusting." Another pause. "She said she wanted to practice." He turned around. "Practice what?" "Listening." Victoria looked at him with the expression of someone who was still deciding how much hope was safe to have about something. "She said she wanted to practice actually listening to me, not waiting for a break in what I'm saying so she can offer the correct solution." He looked at her. That's a lot for her to admit." "I know." "Are you going to go?" "Yes." Her voice was certain even while the rest of her expression was still working through it. "Of course I am." She looked at the table. "She's my mother. She's infuriating, and she's managed, and she spent 2 years pushing Damien Holloway at me like a cure for something I didn't have. But she's also the person who sat in a hospital waiting room for 14 hours when I had my appendix out at 30, and then told me I should eat better when I got home, as if bad diet caused appendicitis." She pressed her lips together. "She sat there for 14 hours. She didn't have to. She stayed." "She stayed," he said. "She always stays. That's the thing about her, under all the managing." Victoria looked up. "She stays." He thought about what she'd said once, that her mother loved through management, loved through trying to make everything go the right way. He thought about how that kind of love could suffocate and anchor at the same time, and how you could spend years pushing against the suffocating part without seeing that the anchor had kept you from drifting somewhere worse. "Go to dinner," he said. "Let her practice." She nodded, and something in her face was quieter than it usually was about things involving her mother, which meant she was already letting some of the bracing go. That was its own kind of progress. The dinner with Eleanor happened on a Wednesday. Victoria texted him when she got home. She asked about my photographs. She asked to see some. A pause, then, "I'm showing her the fire escape one. Wish me luck." He wrote back, "You don't need luck. You need her to see it right." 3 minutes. She said it was lonely and beautiful. She asked why I liked it. Then, I told her the truth. I said I liked it because it looked like something that existed to help people escape, but mostly just stood there holding the weight of the building. She was quiet for a while. Then, she said she recognized that. He read that last one twice. Put the phone down, picked it up. "That's a good dinner," he wrote. "Yeah," she wrote back. "It is." December turned into the new year without ceremony. The Whitmore building celebrated in its building way. Someone set off a small firework in the parking lot at midnight that was illegal and brief and greeted with a cheer from 2 different windows, including Lily's, who was allowed to stay up and who treated the firework as vindicating something she'd been arguing for about the parking lot's potential. Victoria was on Caleb's couch with a glass of wine, and Caleb was beside her, and Lily was at the window giving commentary on the parking lot activity with the authority of a field reporter. And when midnight happened, they clinked glasses and Lily threw her arms around both of them simultaneously in the indiscriminate way of a child distributing affection with no accounting system. Victoria hugged her back with both arms, without thinking, without any part of it being performed or considered, just the reflex of someone who had become, over months, someone to whom an 8-year-old throwing herself at you was a thing that happened and was entirely welcome. Caleb watched this and thought, there it is again, that exact thing. Later, after Lily had been deposited in bed, later than usual, New Year's exception, which she'd been citing for 2 weeks as a precedent for future late bedtimes, and the apartment had gone quiet and the city outside was doing its New Year thing in the distance, they sat on the couch and didn't put the television on. "I want to ask you something," Victoria said. "Ask." She was holding her wine glass, turned slightly toward him, her feet tucked under her in the way she'd arrived at over months and now just did. "If there had never been a bad date," she said, "if I'd never knocked on your door that night with mascara on my face and my shoes in my hand," she looked at him steadily, "would you still have wanted me to?" He looked at her. The apartment was around them. The yellow-lit kitchen visible through the doorway, the bookshelves with their slight crookedness he'd stopped noticing, the farm table, the refrigerator with the horse drawings that had multiplied over months into a full gallery of Lily's emotional equestrian investigations. The pineapple magnet, the photo strip where he and Lily were making faces. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it more than once, in the honest accounting he did of things when it was late and Lily was asleep and the apartment was quiet around him. He'd thought about what was coincidence and what was inevitability, and whether those were even as different as people assumed. "I noticed when you were in the hallway," he said, "every time, for almost a year." He looked at her. "I noticed the way you walked, and the way you stopped to let the elevator go before you, and the way you said good morning and meant it differently than most people mean it." He paused. "I knew which apartment was yours before you knocked on my door. I'd figured it out from the mail and from seeing your light on at 2 a.m. through the window when I was up working." He held her gaze. "I kept not knocking because I didn't have a good reason, and I didn't want to be the guy who needs a reason." She was very still. "You would have knocked eventually," he said. "Maybe not that night, but eventually, because you'd been standing outside my door 6 times already, and the 7th time you were going to stop making excuses." He watched her face. "The bad date didn't bring you to my door. It just stopped you pretending the door wasn't already where you wanted to be." She looked at him for a long moment. In the low light, with the distant sounds of a city in its first hour of a new year outside, she looked like every version of herself he'd accumulated. The woman in bare feet at midnight, the woman at her mother's table saying what was true, the woman kneeling beside his farm table to get the angle right, The woman who laughed at his daughter's sparrow logic. The woman who said, "I'm in love with you" at a kitchen table with her hands around a mug of chamomile. "I would have knocked," she said. "I know I would have." "I know too," he said. She leaned over and kissed him, brief, certain, the kind of kiss that doesn't need to prove anything. And then she settled against his side, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet of the apartment together. And outside, the city was going about the business of beginning something while they stayed where they were. Here was the thing Caleb had learned, or relearned, or finally understood in a way that had weight to it. Stability was not the enemy of being chosen. He'd believed for a long time, believed it in the part of himself that he'd formed in the years after Dana left, in the quiet stretches of single fatherhood where he'd told himself that being reliable was its own kind of dignity, even if it was never quite enough, that a man who was steady and present and showed up got taken for granted, got appreciated in the abstract and overlooked in the specific, got to be the foundation that other people built on without being what anyone actually chose. He'd been partly right and mostly wrong. The problem was never being steady. The problem was being steady without being seen. The problem was walls you put up to protect yourself from being the closest door instead of the chosen door. Walls that also kept out the people who were actually trying to find you. Victoria had knocked down no walls. She'd just knocked on the actual door, and he'd opened it, and both of them had been afraid of some version of the same thing, her that wanting something unmanageable would undo her, him that being needed wasn't the same as being wanted, and both of them had been wrong in the ways that mattered most. And there was this. You did not have to be exceptional to be chosen. You had to be real. You had to be present. You had to stop performing the version of yourself that was least likely to get hurt and start being the version that was most honestly you, which was always more interesting and more worth the risk, even when it was harder. He'd fixed a lot of broken things in his life. He knew that the things that looked most done were sometimes the most worth working on. He knew that under layers of wrong choices, the original material was usually still good. He knew that the difference between something that could be saved and something that couldn't was almost always about the bones. Whether the fundamental structure was sound, whether the thing was built for the right reasons in the first place. He and Victoria, their bones were good. He was certain of that in the particular way he was certain about things when he'd stopped second-guessing them and just let himself see clearly. 3 months into the year, Caleb signed a lease on the studio in East Nashville. The rents had come down slightly from their peak, and he'd had a run of work. Referrals from the Vanderbilt professor, then a commission from a design firm that had found his work through a colleague of Griffin Hale's, then a private client who collected Victorian furniture and had been looking for someone whose approach she trusted with genuinely valuable pieces. It was enough. The studio was a real space, high ceilings, north-facing windows, room for the larger work he'd been turning down for lack of room. He told Victoria on a Tuesday. She was at the table with her laptop half open, one of those evenings where she worked, and he worked in the same space, and it required no commentary. "I signed the lease today," he said. She looked up. She understood immediately what he meant. They'd talked about the studio off and on for months. Her face did the warm, unmanaged thing. "Show me pictures," she said. He showed her pictures on his phone. She looked at them carefully. The ceilings, the light, the back wall where he was planning the storage. She asked questions that were practical and specific, the way she asked questions when she was actually interested, as opposed to performing interest. "I want to see it," she said, "when it's set up. I want to see it before. I want to see what you're starting with." He looked at her. "Why?" She handed his phone back. "Because I've seen the things you make. I want to see where they come from." He thought about her kneeling beside his farm table with her film camera to get the angle of the light, about the fire escape photograph, the one that was lonely and beautiful, the one her mother had recognized something of herself in, about how Victoria photographed the things that existed quietly, that held weight without being seen holding it. "Okay," he said, "Saturday. I'll take you Saturday." She nodded and looked back at her laptop, and that was that. And they worked in the same room until 9, and then ate the leftover rice she'd brought and watched half of a documentary about migratory birds that Lily had insisted on starting the previous weekend and that had turned out to be genuinely compelling and went to bed at 11, and it was entirely ordinary, which was the point. The entirely ordinary Tuesday evenings, the shared space with the half-open laptop, the leftover rice, and the documentary about birds and the going to bed at a reasonable hour. That was the actual thing. Not the dramatic moments, not the dinner where everything landed and Damian Holloway walked out and Eleanor Ashcroft said something true, not even the night in the kitchen at midnight when she'd first walked through the door. Those moments mattered, but they weren't what made it real. What made it real was this: two people showing up for the ordinary, choosing the Tuesday, choosing the leftover rice and the slightly too yellow kitchen light and the farm table with the mark that never quite buffed out, choosing to stay when there was no crisis to justify staying because the staying itself had become the thing they were doing. Lily named the sparrow that visited the window ledge in April. She named it Victoria, which she announced at breakfast with great seriousness. Victoria, the human one, was present for this announcement and received it with the gravity it apparently warranted. "That's an honor," she said. "I know," Lily said. "Sparrows are resourceful," Victoria said. "That's why," Lily said, and returned to her cereal. Caleb looked at Victoria over Lily's head. She looked back at him with the expression she had when she was containing something real, the slight pressure at the corner of her eyes, the set of her mouth. In the morning light of his kitchen, their kitchen, it had become in the daily practice of a shared life, even without the formal accounting of it. She looked like herself, entirely like herself. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi," she said back. Outside on the window ledge, the sparrow blinked once and flew.